Now I'd like to welcome to the show Kevin Kosar, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Kevin.
Thank you, Richard.
Let's talk about Congress. Someone has to. According to the most recent poll numbers I was able to find, the approval rating for our legislative branch of government is currently about 13%. That's pretty low. Um, are Americans right to be so negative about Congress these days?
Uh, yes and no. On the one hand, yeah, there's a lot of dysfunction. Um, Congress can't pass a budget, or it simply chooses not to. The appropriations bills are not being passed, meaning that we keep flirting with government shutdowns, even though we all know that this work needs to be done once per year. Nonetheless, Capitol Hill behaves as if it's like a sudden surprise, and oh my goodness, this is due in 30 days. What are we going to do? Like, this is a constitutional responsibility. They should be doing it. Yeah, there are a lot of characters in Congress today, particularly in the House of Representatives, who don't behave in ways that I think garner a whole lot of respect or show a whole lot of dignity. So, yeah, Americans are right to be upset about that. On the other hand, Congress is functioning. It is passing laws. If you go out to congress.gov and you search to see what statutes have been passed, you'll be surprised to see it's not just post office namings. They're actually passing real legislation. Now, you may dislike the bills, but they are functioning. They're doing oversight hearings. They're obviously giving the Biden administration a whole lot of grief, particularly in the House. So it's functioning, but a lot of the kind of stories of how it's functioning just don't get conveyed by the media because they're boring. Who really cares if they held a hearing to ask questions of the Federal Aviation Administration? Your average American doesn't care about that and doesn't want to read a report on it or click an article on it. So that stuff tends to get undercovered.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic because there are some things, even oversight, which is sort of like the least sexiest part of all this, which does rise up to the level of being like top level news stories like this hearing with the three like Ivy League university presidents
Mhm.
talking about anti-Semitism and free speech and all that stuff. That certainly got up, to the top of the headlines.
Yeah.
And when the Senate does like a confirmation on a Supreme Court justice, those are, some recent ones have been notably dramatic. But you're right about the like, FAA oversight or, post office oversight, something that I know is near and dear to your heart. The functioning of the U.S. Postal Service. Those are the like, especially non-sexy things that I think happen in the background, and they're important, right, in terms of like the functioning of our government over time. But most Americans never see that, right? Even I'm not sure even the C-SPAN programmers always focus on that stuff. Um, so I
Mhm.
wonder, excuse me, if there's any way, how does that dynamic work out in sort of like public opinion terms? How do you get people to understand something that's too boring for them to want to pay attention to in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question at the center of representative democracy. How do you get people to pay attention to things that are important if they don't feel like paying attention to things that are important? And people have been wrestling with that for a long time. I can recall that Walter Lippmann, kind of great progressive thinker of the early 20th century, he wrote a fabulous book called The Phantom Public. And he said, everybody says that we can make our country better is it if more citizens just paid attention. And the answer to that is more civics education. And he basically shows that this is not going to get you where you want to go. And he says, well, if we just encourage people to consume more serious news and try to pay attention. And his response, and mind you, this was 100 years ago when government was so much smaller, was your average citizen, even if they wanted to, couldn't come remotely close to paying attention to all the things they should. Like, is Monday night after I get off work night that I'm going to look into transportation policy. And then Tuesday night, I'm going to devote to studying the vagaries of trade. And then Wednesday, it'll be alliances and military matters. Like, it's impossible. It's impossible. That's what happens when government gets too big. The average citizen can't comprehend it. And even if you're able to get them to comprehend a bit more, it's still like the tip of the tail of the elephant.
Well, yeah, I know I've definitely seen versions of that. The sort of excuse me, the political theory that everyone just needs to be pay more attention to public life. And during the Occupy movement, a lot of people focused on the encampment and what was going on in New York City and Zuccotti Park and Occupy New York. But of course, there was Occupy in lots of cities, including here in Washington, D.C. We actually had two Occupies. We had we had Occupy at McPherson Square and Occupy at Liberty Plaza near the uh, National Press Building, where I was working at the time. And one afternoon, I walked down to talk to some of the occupiers and see what they're up to. And one of them had this really fascinating poster he had printed up about what our society and government would look like in a more enlightened future where, big banks and financial institutions didn't control everything, and we had a more kind of socialist type government that was for the people, right? For the 99%, not the richest 1%. And it involved a very complex diagram of all of the institutions that would replace a capitalist influence. And he said, well, everyone, in society you'll be part of a sort of like a trade group, like a union, right? But then based on what your job is. But then you'll also be part of some sort of like regional governing structure, right? So you'll be, a citizen of some region. And then, based on your age or your interests or your hobbies, you'll also be part of, and this is sort of kind of a recapitulation of some stuff from the Soviet era. You'll be part of the youth congress or the sport congress or the whatever your hobby is, if you're a mother, if you have children. And he was explaining all these sort of overlapping organizations that we would all now be part of, and we would be directly participating in because we want direct democratic socialism. But by the time he got to the end, I realized there would be like 20 different organizations you would be a voting member of, but that you would also have to like go to meetings for and do homework for. And so the idea, whether it's a sort of normie center left version of good government, what we call progressive today, or whether it's this more sort of like big complex Soviet model, it seems like adding 100 new meetings a month to your list of things to do is maybe not really the utopian solution some people seem to think it is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's the old snarky saying? Meetings are for people who have, you know, nothing better to do. And the average person who's trying to earn a living, family obligations, whatever, better themselves through study of the arts in their spare time. Yeah, that sort of world crowds in on that freedom, and yeah, it just flies in the face of what was the so I can't remember the name of the sociologist, but he called it the iron law of oligarchy, where he said basically any group activity, there's going to be some people who are so into it and have the resources and the kind of energy and perhaps even the fanaticism that they're going to dominate it. It's kind of like school projects. There's always somebody who's kind of the free rider hanging back on the school poster that you guys are putting together, or the play you're trying to put together, and then somebody who's kind of leading the show. And that's just human beings for you. And that's going to happen no matter what sort of structure you're in. I will say that, the media could help Americans a bit by just dropping in some kind of more good news or informational type stories. It doesn't have to be didactic finger waving, but at least they could like focus on some stuff that's going right on Capitol Hill and give some credit instead of just relentlessly dumping on the institution and highlighting the kind of craziest, most dysfunctional people in it.
Those do seem to be the people that get the most attention.
They do.
So, I mean,
studies that have shown that like Marjorie Taylor Greene is better known, like 10,000 times better known than like the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, which is nuts.
well, when we think about, not wanting to spend all of our time, even we don't want to spend all of our time, even Washington, D.C. people don't want to spend all of our time thinking about Congress. And we certainly can't expect normal Americans everywhere in the country to spend all of their time working about this. Obviously, Congress itself is the solution to that, right? Not everyone in the United States votes on everything. We delegate political power. We elect our representatives, and they go, and that's their job. That's what we pay them for, right? They're the ones supposed to worry about all this. But one of the big arguments about Congress, not being as functional as we'd like it to be, is that they have too much to do and they don't have enough staff and resources, sort of legislative capacity. Um, and so I think when we think of all the things that we expect Congress to do, and hopefully in a perfect world do well, um, that that seems right. Maybe that they don't have enough resources and stuff to make sure they individual members of Congress are up to date on all the stuff they're going to be voting on. And so anyone who's like worked in Congress or adjacent to Congress can probably testify to that. But I think to the general public, selling this as a solution or even sort of part of a solution is oh well Congress just needs more money and more employees. That doesn't seem like the thing the average populist American is going to be like, oh yeah, we'll just give them even more money. Um,
Nope.
but is that is that part of the solution?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, look, um, there's this interesting dynamic that uh, our representative national government over time tends to like build more and more things in the form of agencies, policies, programs. So there's this aggregation that just builds and builds and builds. And in and of itself, that's a problem. There's a lot of waste and redundancy. There's just stuff that the government's doing that maybe there was a great reason to do it 30 years ago, but there's not anymore. And I think one of the things we have to figure out is how do we flip the incentives to encourage the culling of the things that we don't need. So that admitted, nonetheless, yeah, Congress has a longstanding habit of growing the executive branch, but not concurrently growing its own capacity to manage it. In many ways, our national legislature is still very amateur and very kind of mid 20th century. I mean, goodness, look at the process they use for learning. Congressional hearings. That's one of the processes. You bring in witnesses, they present evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Is that really a good model for a bunch of people to learn to sit in front of cameras up on a dais and have witnesses parade in and give a 3-minute statement and then submit a lump of paper and then just have people ask questions? Like, I think we've developed other ways of pedagogy that are probably a little more sophisticated and probably would work a little bit better and would be less likely to be kind of hijacked for partisan purposes and all that. And yeah, I mean, the House of Representatives, my goodness, it's astonishing to think that there are fewer staff in today's House of Representatives than there were in the 1980s when government was so much smaller. So if you got a legislature that builds up a big executive branch, yes, it should start cutting that executive branch down to size to make it more manageable. But in the meantime, you also got to flow more staff in. You got to get better technology so that you can control this beast. I mean, we on the right often freak out and complain about a muck administrative state. Well, in our Madisonian system, there's not a whole lot of ways you can counter the power of the administrative state other than if you get lucky in a federal court or through Congress. That's what you got. So yeah, staffing up Congress, strengthening Congress is important.
Well, this is another thing that comes up in when people talk about how Washington D.C. really works. The sort of behind the scenes is that a lot of congressional staffers are very young and don't have a lot of, if any, with all due respect to those fine, hardworking 20-year-olds, expert area like expertise, when they get those jobs, right? Certainly staffers, the sort of legislative assistants and in the individual offices working for individual members, they don't. They're usually not tech experts or defense experts or any of those things. So the people who work in the committees, maybe sort of more so, and a lot of people when they go to work on Capitol Hill, they go to work as like a staff assistant or a legislative assistant, and they're not paid a whole lot compared to what they could make in the private sector or compared to the cost of living in Washington, D.C. And so a lot of people, they work for a few years there and then they go work for a lobbying organization or a trade association or something like that, meaning that there aren't a lot of people with sort of deep knowledge like that, the way I think most Americans probably assume there are. And so, this is another one of those same questions like, oh, well, are we going to solve the problem of government being too big by just giving them more money? Does it make sense to say, well, maybe we do need to pay some of these people, $200,000 if they could make $300,000 working for a big law, lobbying firm instead, just so you have people with some consistent knowledge about how stuff works in
Yeah,
the body that makes laws for all the stuff that's supposed to work.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if you don't like lobbyists having significant influence over what ends up in a law, then one way you counter that is have people who are as smart and as experienced as the lobbyists working on Capitol Hill. And when we surveyed congressional staff, I believe the result amongst our sample was that the average congressional staffer would hang around for about 6 years and then would bail and either go work for the executive branch where they would get paid more and the hours would be more normal, or they'd go work for the private sector and get paid a lot more. And by the way, in both the executive branch and in the private sector, they don't have to deal with constituents. They don't have to deal with voters. They don't have to deal with the anarchic congressional calendar, trying to get 535 legislators to get together and to schedule their work. It's a challenge. Nobody can really boss them around and force it. Everything has to be done by consensus. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a funny thing. I had never planned to be an old man of Washington, D.C., but I've hit my 20th year here. And postal policy is obviously something I know a great deal about. The number of people in town who know as much about postal policy as I do is quite few. And I say that not because I'm bragging, but because people who do learn the topic, they get old and they drop dead. They move into the private sector. Uh, you know, there are just not many of them around. And meanwhile, you have legislators and congressional staff who don't know anything beyond the fact that they get mail, being forced to answer questions on this. So I am regularly having to educate them and try to help them understand what's going on. But you could be sure there are lobbyists left and right. People work for the unions, the postal unions, and for private corporations who are also in their ear and who are also trying to persuade them.
Well, yeah, and if you ever come by here and visit our offices on L Street, we are right next to the American Postal Workers Union, so we can
Mm-hmm.
have a strategic conversation there. Maybe we need Meg Ryan on Capitol Hill for a You've Got Mail retrospective hearing. Just to get the issue back in the news. Um, so you sort of like hit on one thing there, which is, if you decide to, if you're somebody who works for Congress and you decide to move out of Congress, then you don't have to worry about voters and constituents and those annoying people who, had to have some sort of input on things and are expecting a response from their member of Congress. Um, you know, that is a pressure that exists in almost no other workplace, right? Almost no other institution has that kind of dynamic. And so Congress is kind of unique in that sense. And but it makes me wonder, like, to what extent there's a sort of natural limitation on the effectiveness of Congress, just because the members themselves are human beings, and obviously they have the same family and personal issues that anyone else has. They have the day-to-day job, but they also have to fundraise and they have to run for re-election and occasionally get in partisan slap fights with people in their own caucus. um, do we have an institution now that has so many responsibilities that theoretically it's supposed to be doing so much that no group of 535 human beings could actually make it work just because of the dynamics of we're all human beings?
Yes, in short, that is correct. I mean, last I counted, there were more than 180 executive agencies, and I couldn't even count the number of policies, programs, to say nothing of the various sub bureaus and units within these entities. You just can't comprehend the whole of it. Government giganticism is a real issue. Um, that said, that doesn't mean that, oh, it's hopeless and we should just do nothing. Much of the history of the 20th century on Capitol Hill is Congress bolstering its capacity sporadically, professionalizing itself. I mean, if you went back to 1900 and walked into our Congress, you would have been shocked. I mean, members sitting at their little desks. There were no giant office buildings where their staff could assemble. So their staff were lurking around out in the hallways and tucked into various other places within the Capitol. There were no nerds. There was no government accountability office. There was no congressional research service. There was no congressional budget office. All these nonpartisan nerds who can help members better do their job, they didn't exist. But over time, Congress has invested in these folks, but it's always been in this kind of spasmodic sort of way after the executive branch gets too big due to war or something else. And then Congress says, oh, geez, maybe we should invest in ourselves a little bit. But yeah, no, our last period of serious congressional reform was in the early 70s. So 50 years have passed, and that's a lot of government growth, a lot of executive branch growth, a lot of growth in the number of like private sector contractors who are carrying out huge amounts of federal government work, to say nothing of all the various people employed in the states who essentially their job is to do federal work, even though they're employed by state agencies. And yeah, Congress really, I mean, if we want to have representative government where our elected officials have any chance at directing this behemoth, we've just got to get more people on Capitol Hill. We've got to get more systems in place where they can do this monitoring. Interesting factoid, the average member of the House of Representatives now has 760,000 constituents. It's obscene. And that number is going to keep getting bigger because we've capped the number of members of the House at 435, which it's been at for 100 years.
Right. So the last big effort of sort of congressional modernization was, the 1970s. So supercomputing abilities, computers have gotten much smaller, but the federal budget has gotten much larger. And the total number of projects and policies that they have to theoretically do oversight of has gotten bigger. So it's interesting, among all of these like government reform proposals, there's a lot of them floating out there, especially from people who might like to make the federal government smaller, not just more effective, but perhaps smaller as well. There, some of these I think run into almost kind of a paradox here, sort of a conflict where you have something like the regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, called the Reins Act, as in like pulling the reins on government. So that's a bill that's been proposed now in multiple Congresses. We've not yet managed to pass it, but that would require Congress to vote on new federal regulations coming out of the executive agencies. So instead of the executive branch agencies just passing rules, including sort of very expensive ones, in the future, this would mean that Congress would have to affirmatively say, yes, this is okay, we approve this rule going into effect, whereas they don't have to do that now. And so I feel like that's something that, a lot of people here at CEI and other allies out there have said that this would be good for democratic accountability and policymaking, because a federal agency can't just pass a rule that is going to exert $1 billion burden on Americans without Congress at least giving the thumbs up. But if Congress were going to actually do that for every major federal rule, even if it were just the $100 million a year ones, surely then they really would need some increased, legislative capacity and hiring more people and analysts and economists and maybe even someone who knows something about technology. So what do you think about that? Is there sort of a conflict there between like, one, there's this like theoretically great reform that would give us more democratic accountability, but Congress would have to do a lot more, and we're a little shaky on them doing what they're supposed to do now. So how would that work?
Yeah, how would that work? That's a great question. Yeah, it would shove another responsibility on Congress's lap, and it would just have to keep juggling. It's like one more ball thrown into those that they're already up in the air and falling all about them. Yeah, I've written in favor of the Reins Act. But with that, I also, with my colleague at AEI, Philip Wallach, we wrote a paper on why Congress needs a congressional regulation office. And it's precisely to empower legislators to be able to look at regulations, significant ones, and say, is this good or is this bad? I mean, right now they're stuck relying upon, the executive branch, and there's a little bit of self-interest going on over there. So yeah, if you're going to give Congress an additional duty, then you'd better make sure they have the capacity in place, because otherwise they're just going to drop the ball. It's just as simple as that.
So, you mentioned that there are policymakers at the state level who they're like state employees, and basically their job is just to like deal with all the stuff rolling downhill from the feds. But uh, I'm sort of interested about looking this from the state legislature perspective. So, unlike a lot of other countries, the U.S., our legislative branch, the U.S. Congress, has 50 little mini clones all around the country. And almost all of those, except for Nebraska's famous unicameral state legislature, almost all of those are structured pretty similar to the way Congress itself is. In fact, even the state capitals often look a lot like the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. So, given that obviously they have different responsibilities, but given the fact that they're sort of superficially structured in the same way, uh, is there are there lessons we can learn from the way state legislatures function and the way they've made improvements or not made improvements over the years that we could say actually Congress should be doing something that Idaho or Iowa or Texas did?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Yeah, the folks at the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, they had a session where they brought in people from state legislators, and I think a number of things were revealed. One of which is that most state legislatures have fiscal control in form of either a balanced budget amendment or limitation of some sort, which is just lacking at the federal level. And that means you could just keep borrowing money. Congress can just run relentless deficits. Presidents will sign off on them, and government gets bigger. Well, then you get your management problems. There's too much to manage, and nobody's in charge, and there's opportunity for rent seeking and all that sort of stuff. Um, if you have budget scarcity, then that forces legislators to make rational trade-offs. And we see a lot of that at the state level. They make hard choices. I mean, so it's painful to watch sometimes, when they start saying, we don't have enough money for our local state university, and they have to start laying people off. Like, that's a bummer, but it's a consequence of them having a limitation. So I think there's that. Certainly, we don't have a lot of states with an upper chamber that has a filibuster, which creates this kind of bizarre two-track sort of situation where something that the Senate is supposed to do, if one person says, well, I'm gonna filibuster it, it gets put in this bucket over here, and then they just have secret negotiations about it versus the stuff that just gets brought up under unanimous consent and everybody just goes, aye, and it moves through. Which in itself can be a little distressing to the average citizen because you want to know where's the debate. Most states don't have that sort of thing. In other ways, the states, some of them are really amateurish legislatures, and they don't have a lot of authority, and it's a very executive-driven system. And depending on your idea of what representative democracy is, that may be a bad thing, or that might be a good thing. Certainly at the federal level, we were structured to have all legislative authority to exist within the Congress, all revenue raising authority to exist within the Congress. And that has been bleeding away over the years to the alarm of many of us on the right who want to pull that power back in, but also want to see that it's used wisely. So yeah, more can be learned from the states. The real trick is whether Congress is going to have the gumption to make the changes that are needed.
Hmm. Now, the proposals we've seen to, hire more staff and researchers and everything could end up being useful, but it seems to me that they might not get the chance to do their job without some other procedural reform, which you sort of like hinted at there with the idea of there's this stuff that sort of happens off the books. A bunch of senators are getting together in a room about whether we can file for cloture on a bill that's that's being filibustered or not, and that's not really part of what most people think of as sort of like the normal order of debating legislation.
Mm-hmm.
And you also said before, the Congress not really passing a budget in a normal way, passing budget bills, but rolling everything into what we call like omnibus bills, where you have a bunch of stuff that's just sort of shoved in together. And if if the leadership of both of the houses of Congress keep sort of like, doing this and, trying to pass these huge omnibus bills, under a huge deadline, so they sort of have to, they sort of must pass sort of things. If Even if we do have a bunch of highly paid, well educated, staff experts, would they get to do their jobs if we only have, members only have 24 hours to vote on a 3,000 page omnibus bill? Um, well, you could have 10,000 experts and it wouldn't matter because, there's not enough time for even one person to read the bill. So, to what extent does the discipline have to come from, the heart and soul of these individuals who are the members, and specifically even the really small number of people who are in leadership at any given time?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. For any of this to work, legislators are going to have to want to be legislators, and not simply kind of members of Team Red or Team Blue who kind of sit in the back and wait for leadership to do something and then inevitably hoot that they weren't consulted enough. Um, it's going to require essentially trying to reverse what has been a flow of power upwards into both chambers and to push that back down, which, when Kevin McCarthy tried to become speaker back in January, that was one of the things that he had to agree to do, which was to try to devolve some authority downward. Um, Unfortunately, in the course of cutting that deal, he cut another deal that virtually guaranteed he was going to be hung later, and he was. But yeah, you have to have legislators who want to do the hard work of legislating. That is sitting in committee and grinding through complicated issues and writing bills and haggling with others, and then being rewarded by getting a vote on the floor. I think that's one of the really bad things that's happened, is that members have gotten to the point where they look to either the majority leader of the Senate or the Speaker of the House and say, okay, coach, what do you want us to do? And the expectation is that that person at the top gets to choose what stuff gets voted upon. There's no expectation that if I get my work done and I report a bill out, that it should be voted on within 10 days or something like that. It's just one more thing being thrown in the hopper, and maybe the boss will look at it one of these days. Like, no, legislators have to assert themselves. They need to pick leaders who agree to bring bills to the floor and who will even let bills fail on the floor. It's not a bad thing. Instead of having all these votes kind of stage crafted, where like the results before even having the vote, in which case it's like, well, why are we having the vote anyway? It's like a ceremonial thing almost. So yeah, and that's one thing I and others have been trying to just educate legislators and staff that, like, you guys have the power. A leadership-driven system is not handed down from God. It's not mandated by the Constitution. It's not even normal if you look at the history of Congress over 200 years. So be the change, seize the power.
Well, yeah, and I think the reason for optimism here, I think people listening to the conversation might say, well, we're saying, well, Congress, members of Congress need to like be better and work harder and to stop doing all the things they've been doing for decades. And like, well, why would you think that, right? Why wouldn't we always just keep going through in the same direction we've been going, to the the easiest uh uh least complex way of doing stuff, which is the not great situation we have now. But I think the reason why there is some reason for optimism is that members of Congress didn't get there just because they raised their hand, right? They spent a lot of time and energy getting there, right? And the vast majority of them, we might disagree about their views on particular topics, but they do want to do something good for their constituents. They do want to represent them, and they do want this country to be better. And the only way they're going to get across the finish line of enacting any policy that's going to help their constituents is going through this process, doing things like you said, reasserting some control back from a leadership driven model of Congress, doing that oversight. They already have to do all of the some of them are better than others, but they do that constituent service. They hunt down the Social Security Administration when someone doesn't get their check, all that sort of classic examples of representing their voters. So the the reason why we might hope and expect members to actually do this stuff is because they really do want to get something done for their constituents. And that is, I think, well, there's reason for cynicism in general about the way Congress functions. I think that really is true of pretty much, all those men and women up there.
Yeah, yeah. I think, look, any organization that a human being joins is going to socialize people more or less, and for better and for worse. I've worked for organizations that are great at socializing new employees. I've also been part of an organization that's very dysfunctional and was socializing people and incentivizing them in the wrong ways. And people who get to Capitol Hill, I think very early on feel these intense pressures, particularly in the House, to put on a red shirt, put on a blue shirt, and then defer to leadership. Um, and there have been efforts to try to get to new members before they kind of get brainwashed that way. And to try to remind them that, yes, you can be a member of a political party without being a complete tool for it.
Mhm.
Your first responsibility is not the party, it's the people back home, and the party is kind of a means to serving them and, ideally the Constitution. But it's not easy. It's not easy. I mean, one thing that makes it harder is the partisan primaries that we use to select legislators. You want to be in Congress? Okay, you get to be a Republican or a Democrat. Very rarely can you run as a libertarian or something else. And then when you have to go through those primaries, you only get about 20 to 25% of eligible party voters who show up. And it's usually the people who are the most intense, the single issue voters and the like. And you have to sell your soul to them to win. And then when you get to elected and you come to Washington, D.C., guess what? 2 years later, you got to go back and see those same people if you're a member of the House. And my God, if you have broken the faith in any way, shape, or form, they're going to primary you. They're going to come after you. And that's a problem. So the way we select members of Congress contributes to the lack of desire for them to do the work that ultimately they're supposed to do in this constitutional system.
Oh man, Kevin, see, I was going to put all the responsibility on members of Congress to be better, but you're saying we as citizens and voters also have to be better? Ugh, that's a lot of work.
I know, what a drag, right? So much
All
easier
right.
just to shift blame to the other people. It's their fault this place is a mess. But no, we all have to do better, and we have to not be such suckers in many ways. Politicians, we look at politics and we think, God, it's also dysfunctional. But if you look at it at a microeconomic level, everybody who's participating is getting better at it. They've got more data to draw upon. They have more kind of PR coaching. They are more, built up to operate in highly effective ways. And one of the ways that they are able to get elected is to feed us red meat, to tell us stories that confirm our priors, to manipulate us, essentially. And for those people who don't bother to show up and vote, well, you're complicit too.
Uh, all right. Well, it is a a bold challenge to all of us to be better voters and citizens, and for anyone running for office out there who might happen to be listening to be a better future member of Congress. So if you need any advice, DM Kevin and I, and we'll be happy to give you advice on being the best possible future member of Congress. Uh, with that, I think our time is up, Kevin. But thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and this has been a really, I think, for politics nerds who want to know more about Congress, has been a fun time.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Now, before we go, where should people find you on the global internet of ideas?
Oh, just Google my name, Kevin Kosar. And if you want to nerd out further on Congress stuff, Google Kevin Kosar, Understanding Congress. You'll find my podcast and plenty of other writings.
All right, fantastic. Because now in the future, everyone has a podcast.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. Thank you, Richard.